Don't you love it when things are both easier and more affordable? Like when the rain washes your car for you. Or like when you save up to 10% by bundling your renters and auto insurance with USAA. Bundle with USAA and start saving. Get a quote today.
This episode is brought to you by Amazon. Sometimes the most painful part of getting sick is the getting better part. Waiting on hold for an appointment, sitting in crowded waiting rooms, standing in line at the pharmacy, that's painful. Amazon One Medical and Amazon Pharmacy remove those painful parts of getting better with things like 24/7 virtual visits and prescriptions delivered to your door. Thanks to Amazon Pharmacy and Amazon One Medical, healthcare just got less painful.
This episode is brought to you by Amazon Prime. From streaming to shopping, Prime helps you get more out of your passions. So whether you're a fan of true crime or prefer a nail-biting novel from time to time, with services like Prime Video, Amazon Music, and fast free delivery, Prime makes it easy to get more out of whatever you're into or getting into. Visit Amazon.com/Prime to learn more.
There's so many different ways you can do anything at any given time. How is it that you decide to do anything at all?
Hello, I'm your host, Les Bubka. Welcome to Anxious Black Belt, a podcast that focuses on karate, mental health, and everything in between. If you enjoy our content and would like to support us, best way to do that is to listen to another episode, share with your friends, and leave us a review. All this stuff helps the mysterious algorithm to introduce our podcast to new audience. Thank you for joining me, and let's listen to the episode. Welcome to the Anxious Black Belt. Today I've got a special guest, Josh Peacock from a Learning Combat, and a special topic that I am getting very confused about, and I hope that Josh gonna be able to explain, because he done extensive research in that, got educated in that, got qualified in that, and is an expert. How are you, Josh?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me on. I'm honored to be here.
Can you take us through a little bit of a background of your martial arts kind of journey?
So I started, as so many did, in taekwondo, in the ATA, and I did that for about 5 years, and got up to third degree black belt. And then I was moving into my teenage years there. I wanted to, at the time, I perceived taekwondo as easy, because we'll get into this later, because of the way the curriculum is structured. So I had memorized everything and I was bored, really. So after that, I was like, well, Kung Fu is pretty sweet, and everyone says it's hard, so I want to do Kung Fu. So we happened to move, and that's when I took my opportunity to not do taekwondo formally anymore. I still practiced my pumse, my forms, and my kicks, but after we moved, I did Kung Fu for about a year, and it was very challenging in terms of fitness. But it's kind of the same, right? Memory based. You do your Kung Fu forms, which they call Dalu or Xing or something like that. I forgot the term. And we ended up moving again. I moved a lot through high school, by the way. And at that time, that's when I got really into karate. And I liked karate because karate came before taekwondo, and that's the bias everyone has, is that the thing that comes before the style you do is the real deal. So karate is the chief influence on taekwondo. So karate's awesome. It's Okinawan. It went to Japan. It's just all these cool little historical. I liked all the little nerdy historical aspects. So I got into karate. I did Kempo karate for a while, which I didn't know at the time was not the most authentic version of it. I did some Shorin-ryu, like a very little bit of Shorin-ryu. I took like a very short time. There's just like stuff going on around me, and like there's a friend who did Shorin-ryu that I studied a little bit with. There was a club locally that I did a couple of lessons of, like Yoshukai, which is like a Kyokushin spinoff.
Mm-hmm.
So I had a little bit of karate there, and then I spent a long time just practicing on my own for several years, towards the end of high school, and early adulthood, and then I came back to teach taekwondo, and then I found my way into Tang Sudo for a short time, which is Korean karate for those who don't know, and I taught that through a business that hired me. And during that time, I took up Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu
Mm-hmm.
because during high school, somebody took me down one time when I was at a beach retreat, and the pressure points that I had been assured were super effective didn't pan out.
Surprised that.
didn't exactly pan out the way they had been advertised. And of course, I didn't spar that much through that period. I did a little bit, but I didn't know they didn't work because everything I tried was compliant. And come to find out, when you practice in a compliant way, your nerves are more vulnerable because you don't tense the muscles around them, you don't move, and those sorts of things. You're not usually not, very prepared to receive hits to vulnerable areas when you're in that state. I didn't know that at the time because I was a teenager, right? I just believed everything everyone told me. So yeah, jujitsu. I did jujitsu. I've done jujitsu on and off since then. Taekwondo has been more of a private practice for me. I've done some of the Olympic sparring. I went to some like independent grassroots seminars and stuff, and sparred with a friend for a long time. Not a long time, but for a while. And so I've kind of stayed connected to the Taekwondo scene, and I still have an affinity towards the karate scene. But what I've practiced on a weekly basis has been jujitsu for, on and off for 10 years. So that brings you about up to speed. There's a little bit of Filipino martial arts mixed in there, a little bit of kickboxing, Muay Thai mixed in there, attached to the gyms that I did jujitsu at. But that's my training history in a nutshell. Did I miss anything in terms of what you wanted me to answer?
No, I think it's brilliant, and that jujitsu is kind of connection why I am talking to you today, because I recently returned after 10 years break from jujitsu, so I'm back to Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and social media's picked up on my training and throwing lots of videos at me, and a lot of is about the ecological approach. So I was like,
Mm,
this is interesting. So I'm gonna
yeah.
start digging into it, and it kind of confuses me. And I hope you're gonna be able to explain it to me, the differences between the whole ecological approach, the game-based approach, and constraintless approach. Because
Hmm.
being as well back in Poland when I was younger, I've been involved in a wrestling club, Olympic wrestling club, and the guys there had a lot of games and like a constraint-led approach, which I kind of
Mm,
introduced into my club long time ago. But listen to your podcast and your guests, there seems to be a very different approach to kind of the people get mixed up, like myself, all those three and using exchangeably, sorry, I think that's the word, and exchangeably, but doing different things, if that makes sense.
hmm.
Can you explain about what is the ecological approach?
Yeah, so the ecological approach. Well, so the ecological approach, broadly speaking, the term refers to more than one thing, but broadly speaking, it is a way of learning or training that is based on a theory of motor learning and behavior called ecological dynamics.
Mhm.
So, so the ecological approach, I would say in the simplest terms, is that it's an approach to learning that has a careful consideration of all of the factors that produce skilled behavior.
Mhm.
And what that means is we want to learn in environments where all the behavior has a sufficient overlap with what you're going to experience in what's called the performance environment or the performance context. So, for example, if you want to anchor performance environment to self-defense, then you're going to have to practice in environments that sufficiently overlap with what you're going to deal with in a self-defense situation. If you want to practice for a kickboxing match, then you need to practice in environments that have a sufficient overlap with what you're going to find in a kickboxing match. So personally, I've taken a concept that falls under the ecological approach known as representative learning design. That means that your practice represents the most important dynamic elements of the performance context. For martial arts, I have boiled that down to aliveness. Aliveness was first coined by Bruce Lee, but his usage of the term was a little bit ambiguous. It has to do more with an authentic expression of the way you move in a given context. Matt Thornton took that concept and he added timing, energy, and motion. Timing, energy, and motion is roughly what you would expect from something that's live, right? You know, when you actually do something that's sparring based or free sparring itself. I took what Matt Thornton did and I boiled it down to unscripted, uncooperative, and they must work together. If it's unscripted but cooperative, it's not alive, right? Or any other way around. So my rule for if something is sufficiently representative of the performance environment is that it's alive. That's the bare minimum. You'll want to add more elements to make it more, you might say realistic. But the thesis of the ecological approach is that is what's most likely to transfer your learning in the applied context. Do you want to get into like transfer of learning at all?
Yeah, wherever you want to go.
Okay.
I'm kind of
Yeah.
blank on all of this. I understand the kind of a game approach because I done that, restrained as well, but ecological thing is kind of new stuff for me. I listened few of the podcasts, but my child brain or maybe old brain doesn't comprehend. So if you can in simple terms explain it to me, that'd be perfect.
Absolutely. Transfer of learning is, I first came across it in my educational psychology studies when I was doing a degree in teaching and learning for my graduate degree. But it's a term that's used across psychology to measure the degree to which a practice environment transfers to an applied or performance environment. Come to find out, there's different types of transfer. And a positive transfer of learning means that there is a actual meaningful skill gain from the practice that you underdid to the performance environment. It means you were actually an improvement in your practice correlated with an improvement in the performance environment, or you were able to access a skill there. There's neutral, which means it didn't hurt you at all. It didn't really do much of anything at all. I think probably this is me just inserting my opinion, probably most of what people do in practice probably has a neutral transfer unless it's live. And then there's a negative transfer, and that means your performance actually got worse, that your ability was actually negatively affected. I think negative transfer is kind of rare. So if you actually succeed in getting negative transfer, you definitely should stop doing whatever it is you're doing. An example of this might be, I don't know all the particulars, but an example of this might be Ronda Rousey. She, I don't know if she married or not. She had a boyfriend a long time ago. He's actually a pretty good MMA fighter. And she got him training with her boxing trainer. And he is notorious because he doesn't produce good boxers. And he never made Ronda Rousey into a good striker. And a lot of people noticed that after he started working with that boxer, he actually got worse at striking. His head movement went away, his dynamicism sort of went away, and he actually actively got worse because of what he was being trained in. And he eventually washed out of competition in MMA. That, pending other variables, that would probably be an example of negative transfer. Whatever he was doing with that guy actively made him worse at striking in MMA, and it adversely affected his career. So transfer of learning, we have a really big emphasis on transfer of learning. Our unique approach to it is the representative learning design concept. And the thing that makes ecological thinkers or ecological researchers different than people in other camps is that we try to, when we do our studies, we try to measure transfer of a practice environment only by means of an environment that is representative. So to back up a little bit, there's an old approach in the research in psychology where I think it's called systematic design, but where everything is tested under laboratory conditions, and then the actual the practice and all that is conducted under laboratory conditions, and then the transfer is also the transfer test is also conducted under those laboratory conditions. So example of this might be, okay, we're going to test something like disguised repetition, right? This is a common thing that is used on the ground level among martial arts instructors. So as an example, disguised repetition. So disguised repetition, we want to get 100 side kicks in this class, and we're going to do it in the air. We're going to do it on the bag. We're going to do it as part of a self-defense. One step, we're going to do it on shields, all that stuff, right? And that's how we're going to get our 100 repetitions in, right? And so what we're looking for is just the repetition of one technique on a bunch of different sort of compliant contexts. And we want to see that if by doing that that disguised repetition, our sidekick technique becomes better. Okay, so we're testing an aesthetic quality of the kick that we have established through our stylistic lens. We want to see, for Taekwondo, we want to see a deep chamber. We want to see a sort of Z shape in the chamber. We want to see the heel shoot out. We want to see a nice line from the shoulder through the lower back, through the heel and that sort of thing. We want to see all of that. That's what we're looking for from a good side kick. So we look at the disguised repetition. They do the side kick. They get some instruction, and then we see in a transfer test, does it improve the side kick technique? Okay. And it might or might not, who knows, it's if the instruction is good enough, if it's not, whatever. Those are the two parts of that test that we're testing. The only problem is we're never testing the function of the kick. So ecological dynamics comes in and says, that's a dumb thing. And I'm being a little incendiary here. That's an irrational thing to test, because the form of the kick is not necessary downline of an increased ability to use the kick. So what are the functions of a side kick? Well, to keep people away, to hurt, to inflict massive damage, because it's a very strong kick. It can be used as a sort of counter kick, right? So it has a lot of functions. But none of those functions are entailed by the form of the kick. The form of the kick in application tends to look different depending on how it functions. So a side kick in Taekwondo that you use to keep people away, it's actually going to have a shallower chamber than the beautiful formal side kick that you see in Pumse, that you're measured on in class, when you're measured on probably for your black belt, right? The form of a side kick for that function is never even tested, never even shows up in the test on the old view. So ecological dynamics says, actually, we need to come in and test the function. And the only way to test the function is to actually engage in a situation where you have to use it in a realistic way. And so the way we would test that is, okay, here's disguised repetition. Did it improve your ability to actually stop people, counter, and inflict damage? Go ahead.
So if I understand it properly, I'm gonna use an analogy from the motoring environments. So we've got the car's mileage being tested in the lab, and it's never the same as driving in a real environment, right? So
Yes.
depending on your activity, if you want to have a 4x4, being in a lab is gonna be totally different
Yes.
measurement, right? Is that
Yes.
that's kind of line of thinking, right?
That is a very good analogy, right? And because those are different environments, and those environments have different factors and different levels of variability.
Mm-hmm. Got it.
Yeah. Yeah. So transfer of learning is really big. We're really concerned with that. On a folk level, and by a folk level, I mean just people that do martial arts, they have a received wisdom about how teaching works, how skill development works, that they haven't questioned very much. They don't really study motor learning. They don't study ed psych, any of those sorts of things. On a folk level, transfer of learning is not a big concern. And if it is a concern, testing which methods lead to better transfer is not a concern. So in traditional martial arts, and this applies to MMA, boxing, and jiu-jitsu as well, the name of the game is how plausible is your rationale. And this is why the kata application thing is such a sticking point. One of the reasons why it's really difficult to get the ecological approach across is because it really just invalidates the application process as a central part of the pedagogy. Not necessarily, if you want to do it for fun, there's nothing wrong with that as an intellectual exercise. But as a way to develop skills, it's backwards, because the demands of the environment should be the starting point for developing skills. So if you want to do self-defense, you need to start with self-defense scenarios as a way to build those skills. If you want to be good at Olympic Taekwondo, you have to start with the Olympic Taekwondo rule set as a way to build those skills. What are the demands? What are the skills? What are the different things that are involved in that? So yeah, these are very, to understand why the ecological approach from a scientific standpoint is so different and so necessary, in my opinion. It requires you to actually to ask some uncomfortable questions about probably everything you believe, everything you were told, everything you've believed about learning in an academic environment, not just martial arts. It requires you to open up put a question mark on things you thought were settled, right? For example, about the utility of repetition, about the utility of compliant, the teaching of exact technique, those sorts of things. These are a given across martial arts, but for traditional martial arts especially, that's our thing. We're really about the precision of the technique, the aesthetic, the beauty, the way it looks. And we kind of use that as an excuse to reinforce our view of all of, or most of, our combat knowledge and our self-defense knowledge coming from the forms, like needing to practice that to actually get better at fighting and get better at self-defense. Any questions at all?
Yeah, so well, I got those conclusions as well, that, kata itself won't win fights, right? So for our dojo, for about, my teacher started, so it must be about 15, 20 years, we're doing kind of opposite. So we're doing application first and then do learn the form. The drawback is form is not as aesthetic as other way around. But recently, what I started to do, instead of doing the exact, we're doing this movement first and that's from the form, I started doing kind of I would think it's a constraint approach. So I would say in this particular situation, it's a hook coming towards you. You block it however you want. I don't care. Protect your head. From there, you need to do a counter, but it has to be a hand. And then you want to be connected and go into grappling. And from this one, it comes for us let's say the Pinan first or something like that. And then I explain this is how it looks if you connect it. The different, everybody's doing it a little bit different, so there are differences. But if you want to formalize this, you need to have a prescribed movements. And then we go to the first section of the kata. So in my understanding, that would be a constraint-led approach, right?
The part where you're practicing blocking tactics and you constrain it to one part of that skill set, right? So we're just using the hands for this part. We want you to get good with defensive tactics with the hands, but you're not prescribing the exact way to do it. That would be the constraint. That would be a form of the constraints-led approach. Yeah. In
So
terms of like,
how would that differ with the ecological approach then?
oh, it doesn't at all. So let me yeah, let's there's so much to get into. It's very it's one of the frustrations of communicating this to the martial arts community is that there's so much complexity and nuance going on in the literature, and there's all kinds of things I don't know the difference between. So we talk about something like, for example, the traditional approach, right? And so we think but the traditional approach is like, there's a tradition in boxing, there's a tradition in karate and taekwondo that's very similar, and they all have overlapping elements and they all have differing elements. And those elements overlap with what's the traditional academic motor learning approach. They're not exactly the same. And then there are differences in traditional approaches inside of the traditional approach academically. And these are kind of different than what's the folk view of it for people that have never studied it before. And some of it, there's so much overlapping that, that kind of, they're all related to one another. And then you get to something that's not traditional, like the ecological approach. There's other forms that aren't ecological approach per se that are also newer and different and have overlapping elements with the ecological approach. So it's like it's impossible to communicate all of that at the same time. So when I'll talk about the science behind the ecological approach and how it's better from the what people do traditionally in martial arts, they think that the traditional approach to whatever they've done in karate, taekwondo, jiu-jitsu is one and the same with the best elements of the traditional approach in science, and it's not. There's a lot more complexity. So they think that actually the way they did it, it's the simpler way to do it. It's the way everyone always done it. And, if there's a PhD somewhere that says that this is the way to do it, then everything I've ever believed is validated, right? Which is just not the case. There's a lot of things that traditional martial artists do that is, I'm a little bit on a tangent here. I'm going to explain constraints and all that. There's a lot of things that traditional martial artists do that the best, most current versions of the traditional approach, let's call it information processing, right? They would absolutely not recommend.
Okay.
They would absolutely not, right? That's a separate can of worms. So ecological dynamics is the theory. The constraints-led approach is a methodology of application. Okay. And the ecological approach is an umbrella that encapsulates the theory, ecological dynamics, and the application methodology, the constraints-led approach. Now, the constraints-led approach is sometimes in the literature called nonlinear pedagogy. It's kind of confusing. They're functionally the same. They share all the same philosophical points. They share the same researchers, the same thinkers. Sometimes nonlinear pedagogy might have slightly wider application than the constraints-led approach. Constraints-led approach is sports. You could principally apply it to anything else, but it's chiefly sports. Nonlinear pedagogy, mostly sports in terms of its the word, what does the word encapsulate, but could encapsulate anything involving learning, academic learning, anything like that on the job. So constraints-led approach, if you don't know anything about nonlinear pedagogy, don't even worry about it. Don't fill your brain space with it. It's the same thing. Functionally speaking, it's the same thing as constraints-led approach. Just, if you happen to read an article and you see, oh no, what is this nonlinear pedagogy? It's okay. Don't despair. They mean the same thing. they're the same thing. Don't worry about it. So ecological dynamics theory, CLA.
So then, if the ecological dynamics is the umbrella, the constraint-led approach is a methodology, then the game-based training would be the execution of those two, right? If I'm thinking all right, that would be the first
games,
bottom level. Using the
almost.
games to apply whatever restraints you've got, right? Is that correct or?
Very close. Very close. This and guys, this is not my fault. I wasn't there when all the researchers can't get along. Researchers don't get along just as much as we don't get along. All of us style heads, Goju-ryu versus Shorin-ryu and all this stuff, Kung Fu versus karate, right? We don't get along on that stuff. I mean, we do better now, but historically we didn't get along on that stuff. Scientists don't get along either, and they like to make up different terms. Okay, not my fault. I'm just telling you what it is. Okay, so here's the thing: games-based. So CLA, the games is an outgrowth of constraints-led approach. Okay, it is a way to practically apply the environment building principles, which are the chief learning design principles of CLA. Games-based training, a label which has certain content, is an overlap with CLA, but it's not the same thing. And here's what I mean by that. CLA is actually borrowed from pre-existing games-based methodologies. One of them is teaching games for understanding. Teaching games for understanding is not originally or primarily a methodology based on ecological dynamics. It has a different theoretical underpinning. Some people have said it has no theoretical underpinning. Others have said it's more based on ed psych concept known as constructivism. That is an approach to physical education that's been adopted by many coaches. And it bears many similarities with the approach taken by the constraints-led approach, in part because we borrowed from them a little bit, but because they like to learn primarily through games. Now, there are some nuances between the two, one of them being that CLA has its own approach to game design, where you're going to get games that you probably won't see in the teaching games for understanding, because teaching games for understanding is a little bit more templated than the CLA is. And you don't have to worry too much about all the complexities of theories of behaviors and stuff, as long as you buy the philosophy of teaching games for understanding. As long as you buy the philosophy of it, you do the games, and you don't have to fill your brain up with all the hard stuff about constraints and stuff like that. The constraints-led approach. Oh, whoops. Now it wants to follow me. There we go. So the constraints-led approach, I got my sloth thing going on here.
Yeah, I'm going to do the same, and there you go.
There you go. Yours is a little bit cooler than mine. I like sloths, though. So the constraints-led approach.
Funny enough, my jiu-jitsu style is a sloth. I'm just laying there and waiting for opportunity.
Yeah, it's a lot of guys. A lot of guys like to do the guard player type of thing. Yep. What was my train of thought? Okay, constraints-led approach. Yeah, so the games-based thing, that's a common misunderstanding. Most people in jiu-jitsu and martial arts really aren't doing teaching games for understanding. So for all intents and purposes, somebody doing games-based in martial arts is probably doing so because of the ecological approach, right? They're probably trying to the best of their knowledge, do an ecological approach, right? And I don't want to like downplay that at all. If people are doing more live training in their practice, I'm happy. I have a little bit of a reputation for like little pot shots at people because they make claims that aren't accurate, and I see that as just people kind of getting a little bit too big for their britches, and they're like, well, because I do this now I just know all the particulars of it. For me, it just feels like a lack of humility, and like they didn't try to like do the work that many of us have done to understand the
you always
details.
got always got people like that, right? Something's popping up
Yeah.
and starting to get traction.
Right.
Oh, I'm gonna try to make money on it or make myself look better, smarter,
immediately.
whatever. Yeah,
Immediately.
yeah.
Yeah, that immediately happened here. But to go back to the constraints-led approach, why is it called the constraints-led approach? Well, in ecological dynamics is actually the marriage of two theories. The first theory is dynamical systems theory. Okay. And out of dynamical systems theory, you have Carl Newell, who posits the theory of constraints. And so in his work in childhood development, Carl Newell, and this is a groundbreaking work in the 80s, right? This is well thought of by psychologists outside of the ecological dynamics space. Carl looks at babies, and he looks at how much learning happens throughout the childhood of the development of a child throughout his childhood or her childhood, and until they're 3 or 4 years old, probably even older than that. Virtually all of the learning is through exploration and imitation, because it is impossible cognitively for you to give detailed instruction, formal instruction, to a child in those age groups. Some kids are more precocious than others, but 1 to 3 generally. I mean, I was not taking formal instructions very well as a 3-year-old. Okay.
Yeah, well, I've got 8-year-old and 6-year-old, so yeah, we're just getting out of a thing that I can actually explain what we're doing instead of just wasting my my speech and just copying.
Yeah. So, but you can see complex motor skills. You can see even sports skills developing in kids at these ages. Kids learn to walk. It's a pretty complex skill. They learn to crawl. It's kind of four limbs coordinating into locomotion is pretty complex. Standing, walk. I mean, that implies standing. Grasping, manipulating objects, pretty complex skills.
Yeah.
None of which are taught. None of them. The only thing you can do is give them an environment that facilitates exploration, and then they develop those skills. Those skills that are untaught form the foundation for all learned skills later on in life. And so if our traditional conception of how things are taught, that motor skills, complex motor skills, most of them have to be taught. How do we account for that? And so Carl Newell says, actually, we develop skills by navigating constraints. So, in biology, and across biology, dynamical systems, all these sorts of things, a constraint in technical usage is simply an object or a force in a system, like an ecosystem or a biological system, that removes degrees of freedom. So as a human, you have all these joints. Your shoulder joints can move in all kinds of different ways. Elbows, wrists. You have so many degrees of freedom in your body. It's dazzling. You never think about it. It's dazzling. So there's so many different ways you can do anything at any given time. How is it that you decide to do anything at all, to move any which way at all? And this, so another researcher called Bernstein calls it the degrees of movement problem. And so Carl Newell says, for every constraint in the system, an entire set of action possibilities is actually taken away. Now, a constraint in the technical usage usually means to take away a set of degrees of freedom. Uh-oh. I have
That
an
was
AI
important.
bot. Yeah. I have an AI bot, and when I do certain gestures, even if it's not the exact gesture, it'll just zoom in. So it takes away a set of degrees of freedom, and that's the technical definition of a constraint. There are ways that you can change or add constraints that actually free things up for you. So it's not always a limitation, technically. You don't actually have to make the game smaller necessarily to manipulate constraints in a way, to engage in a constraints-led approach. You just need to manipulate in a way where the design is intentional, that the constraints influence the behavior of the participants, right? And we call them the athlete system, the athlete competitor system between the two competitors in a match. So he says that actually this solves the degrees of movement problem for the most part, because if we think of the world around us in terms of constraints, those constraints interact with one another to produce movement. And so your body, the organism, is an entire system that operates on the environmental constraints, the raw environmental constraints, that is the world around you, and task constraints, which are typically nominal in the sense of, what is it that I want to do? What are the rules of the game, right? Those constrain out an entire realm of possibilities. The environment as you experience it constrains out an entire realm of possibilities. And then your body, it's the level of training, your level of knowledge of the game, your previous experience, your natural abilities, which can change or regress. All of these work together to create an emergent movement, emergent movements in any given situation. So instead of thinking of everything as needing to be directly taught or even demonstrated, we look at what are the demands of the game, what are the task demands, where do we do the task, the environment, and your opponent, and then we let those things sort of sort themselves out over time. And what we do as coaches is we manipulate the environment. Here we go again.
Important stuff.
Important stuff. Yeah, I need to stop gesturing. No, now it doesn't want to. I think I'm gesturing the wrong way. Come on, dude. No. There we go. Yeah. Okay. I'm just gonna leave it there.
That's right.
So as coaches, what we do is we design environments, and there are some things we do verbally, but and sometimes there's even room, I think, in the constraints-led approach, there's even room for direct instruction. But for the most part, we're trying to let the students to navigate those environments so that they come out of it more adaptable, rather than robots who are just trying to repeat or reproduce the techniques that we teach them.
It's funny enough because recently I just changed about 3-4 months. I changed our syllabus completely from, you know how the taekwondo got the same. You're doing a front kick, this, and this. So we changed it now to the white belt. You need to do the break falls. Second belt, you need to do basic striking, then basic kicking, basic takedowns, basic ground defenses, and then we go to katas only with the higher grades when they've got the. So our approach was, what do we want from our students? Well, I want my students to be able to handle themselves. So therefore, kata is not a necessity on the beginning. But then if you get to the black belt, you achieved all those skills, but what do next? Then you can start digging into the forms and unlocking them when you've got that manual skills of handling yourself and do something, let's say, more educational, digging the history of the movement, where it come from, how you apply this, but you've got the skill needed to apply it to it. What kind of approach would that be, in your opinion?
Your approach.
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
there's any number of ways you could do a constraints-led approach, and I think if you have to understand what the skill is that you're targeting. So
Hmm.
there's this constraints-led approach to developing really good kata.
Hmm.
I watch more Pumse, but I know the karate kata, right? Or
Yeah,
some
yeah.
of them. I don't know all
Well,
the
they're pretty
Goju
much the
ones, but
same.
I know most of the Shorin ones. Yeah. So I like to watch competitions.
Hmm.
I appreciate. I know a lot of karate people don't like that, but I like it. I think it looks good. Um, I like Sport Pumse, which is the Taekwondo version of competitive kata.
Hmm.
I think it looks beautiful, and I think it's like it's it has artistic merit, it has
Hmm.
cultural merit, and there's a reason to do it. Not everything in martial arts has to be some tied to some practical violence application.
Hmm.
So you can do whatever you want in your practice as a coach. If you want to be true to the constraints-led approach, you have to separate the skills and not mix them together. So
Hmm.
getting good at kata in an aesthetic sense is a separate skill from getting good at fighting in
Hmm.
any sense. But also, if you want to engage in a cultural practice of applying the kata into something, that's a separate skill from being good at kata aesthetics. It's also a separate skill from just getting good at fighting. So if you want people to engage in an intellectual exercise of translating kata into sparring, you have to first understand that that is a separate process
Hmm.
from just getting good at sparring. You can go your entire life getting good at karate, sport karate. You can go your entire life getting good at sport taekwondo or Olympic taekwondo, the sparring, never do a kata or a pumse, and be the best in the world, and still look just like every other, not just like, but look identifiably like all the other taekwondo competitors and karate competitors, because the entire time that was actually a separate domain of skills than the kata and the application of the kata. So I think if you can separate those skills and then you can find a unique synthesis on how to progress your curriculum, as long as you understand the differences between all of those skills, that's, to me, that's the constraints-led approach. Now, if you mix them together and start making claims like you absolutely need, you have to do the kata.
Hmm.
You have to apply the kata. You can never be this or that. Well, that's not the constraints-led approach, because it's a muddied view of how skills develop and what is necessary for skills in a given context.
Yeah, we'll see how it's gonna go. I just started it, so I usually change something in my curriculum, give it a five
Mm-hmm.
years, see the results, and then rethink it
Yeah.
and change again. So this is like 7.2 approach now.
Yeah.
So we'll see, right? It's never ending
Yep.
story with improvement, but I think that's the
Always.
need. If you want to be a good coach, you need to keep looking and changing views and
Mm-hmm.
stuff. And for
Mm-hmm.
you, what results did you see with students and people who using the ecological approach? Is there a huge jump in the quality of results? And on top of that, another question is there a much of a resistance to the new approach?
With brand new people who have never done martial arts before, there is no resistance whatsoever. They
Mhm.
love it. They absolutely love it. And I had the benefit of seeing this in the gym that I've trained at for a couple of years. I'm on break right now, but my coach here in Indian Land, North Carolina, I'm sorry, Indian Trail rather, Indian Trail, North Carolina. Um, he changed his curriculum to something that's more constraints led. It's very
Mhm.
games based, and the result was absolutely fantastic. There's I have many years in the traditional approach of jiu-jitsu, learning under those approaches, and these guys are giving me trouble after only a few months of doing this, right? So the results initially are fantastic, and there is no. I think I asked him about this. I never looked at the numbers. He said his retention numbers are fantastic, right? He's also a great coach, anyways, regardless of the approach. So his experience with it has been really stellar. And I know from Scott Seavright, who used to have a podcast that was similar to mine. He's done it through kickboxing, jiu-jitsu, and MMA for many, many years. He's running he founded his school this way almost. Greg Souders, most famous in the space, has done it, and he's taught a pure eco approach for many, many years now, and he has a couple of students who are purebred in that approach coming up who are very good. I rolled with one of them, couldn't do anything, nothing at all. It's his adaptability is unreal. So there's more than that goes into being a champion. So they're still struggling to push over that that hump. But one of his hybrid athletes who started in the traditional approach and then has been training primarily or actually entirely ecological approach for the last several years went to the ADCC. And he didn't win, but he just dominated the competition to get into there. And the best guys in the world are at ADCC, right? And there's more than just, drilling and teaching techniques that goes into people say that those people they all do the drills and the techniques and everything. That's why they beat him. And that's just, I don't think that's the case. I think they spar more. They spar a lot more. They have a lot more sparring, and they do drugs.
Yeah. Right. You look at them and they say, "Oh yeah, they clean." Okay. What would be your recommendation for people like myself who just started? They're not very educated in that subject, but would like to start changing things in the club. What would be the first stage when they starting to educate themselves, reading about it, listening about it, but they want to start doing something different? What would be the first step?
Yeah, the first step is, if you don't want to run a whole class that's entirely constraints led or eco, start with the warm up. Okay, so instead of the calisthenics and the drills, do something that is live, interactive, but very, very controllable. So if you do jiu-jitsu, do some hand wrestling. And so let's say that you just want to maintain connection to the wrist. That's like the simplest version of that, right? And that's the only task. The only task is to maintain control of the other person's wrist. And so now, or two wrists or 2-on-1 or something like that, right? You can change the task parameters. You don't have to do one thing. In fact, you shouldn't do one thing. You should always be changing what those are. That's it. And so now the two opponents are breaking wrist holds and then trying to establish their own holds in different ways, moving around, doing different things, exploring and experimenting. Look at how they're engaging with the task. What you're going to find is probably that they're doing things that you thought you had to teach. They're going to start doing them immediately. Okay. So there's going to be a set of things that they do immediately. Now, they're not going to do everything you're looking for. They might not do something like that for 2 years, but they will get better and they will develop a game that works for them. That just isn't what you're looking for. That's one of the things that you have to start letting go of, is how things should look and what people should be able to do and what they need. They don't actually necessarily need what you think you need, what you think they need. Because people are able to develop creative games around skills that you've never even thought of before, even up to a very high level, right? So just let go of what you think you know and start with one segment of class with some of these games, and then add a second segment with games that are a little bit more complex. There's more going on. There's less control, right? So maybe you're looking to get back control, right? Back control is mediated by hand fighting. So looking for standing back control, but leave the or double underhooks, right? Leave the takedowns out of it, right? And then maybe eventually you can add the takedowns in. Definitely you should eventually let the takedowns in, but that would be an example from grappling. For striking, striking's a little bit different in the way that you design games, because the ranges of the game aren't as obvious as the positions are in grappling. But there are ranges. There's outside of kicking range, there's inside of kicking range, there's punching and elbow range, and there's clinch, right? And clinching and elbow kind of blend together, but clinching is when you're attached. So if clinching is allowed in your rule set, clinching is definitely a stable position to work from. Outside long range is definitely a range to work from, and then in your sort of melee range, which is inside kicking range, where you can punch, elbow, and short kick, all those sorts of things. Leg kick, that's a definite range, right? So you can start playing around from those different games around with constraints around those different things. And my advice is always open it up, because there's a such thing as over constraining. And when you make the game too constrained, you run back into the problem of the rote repetition, because the information you're receiving doesn't match anything close to what you're going to be doing in a match. An example of that would be, and I did this, everyone I've ever talked to did this with applying it to striking, is a jab game where the only purpose is to jab, and the other person either can only jab too or is only on the defensive. I think that's too limited, because the jab has a function, and almost none of those functions are being met by just a game where you jab at each other, right? You're not looking out for the other hand, you're not looking out for other angles from the punch, and that has influences on your ability to develop head movement, your ability to develop different blocking. If you don't let the other person strike back, you're also missing the function of the jab to actually stop an onslaught. So it can get with striking, you have to be a little more careful, because it's a lot easier in pursuit of something that seems properly isolated, that you're drilling down on a skill. It looks alive, but it's so constrained that the information you're dealing with in that performance environment doesn't have much overlap, and thus is unlikely to have much transfer to a skill in the performance environment. So you want to make sure that there are more than just one option for tactics in a striking game, and that the opponent in that game has a sufficient array of counter tactics, so that you're getting a more realistic something that's useful for you to understand how to read and respond properly to something that is likely to happen in an actual match or something.
So it should be really that both people having benefit of the game, right? So they have two different tasks, but they both need to learn something that is useful and usable in the life, let's say sparring or whatever, right?
Yeah, they can have different tasks. They can also have the same task, right? Free sparring is basically the same task, and you can design other games that way. And then some games you design with what I call asymmetrical tasks, where they have slightly different tasks. I think if to give you a really concrete example of how I would remediate the jab game, I would allow. So one of the functions of the jab is to stop an onslaught, right? And it's to be sort of a counter punch, and it can also set up your rear hand. But if you wanted to isolate the counter and the stopping function of the jab, and I would not create an entire class around just one thing, right? I want them to get more skills when they come to class. But maybe this is the highlight. This is the focus of the class. Okay, so we're going to do a couple of games where the stopping, the counter onslaught, aspect of the jab is what we're isolating. So I would allow the opponent to have use of both arms, both punches, and they have roughly a full range of tactics. Maybe I'll limit it just to the head or just to the body, but they have a full range of punching tactics. And the jabber has to use his movement and his jab primarily to stop that the best he can. Okay. And I think that would be a much more useful game. And of course, you want to flip flop and let the other opponent do the jab, and the guy that was jabbing do the open punchings, right? Always allow both to get access to those environments. I think that would be a much better way to approach it. And there's off that one, format. There's tons of different things you can do, but you want to make sure that there's a good amount of variability accessible and creativity accessible to the players.
Would you agree that the first thing that every coach should do, and it might seems obvious, but I think that some people are not applying that you should have a hard look what you actually want to do? Because the problem in karate dojos is that we're doing fitness, self-defense, sport, kata, whatever you want, and people don't look, what do I want to have in my club? Do I am a sport person? Do I am a self-defense? Do I do kata? Do I do meditation? So I think the base thing should be make your mind what you're training for.
Yes. And you can do more than one thing. You just have to separate them and dedicate the resources to those classes. So if you want to do a fitness class and your primary focus is fitness, then you need to do something that's actually intelligent for fitness, because I've been to a dozen or more. I've trained in a dozen or more martial arts schools, and the fitness. Most of these guys don't know anything about training, like on a fitness level. So, you get out of your heart rate's not. You don't. Is it cardio? Is it strength training? Is it supposed to be a combination? They don't really do any one of those three things. They don't do any of those very, very well, right? We do a bunch of push-ups and squats and whatever, and there's no progressions, and we don't use weights, and we don't keep our heart rate in the right zone for long enough. I mean, we just don't. In most martial arts based fitness classes, we're just not. You're better off going to Zumba, frankly. You're better off going and getting a personal trainer, or just watching some YouTube videos and lifting weights at the gym. I'm working on something in the background because we need a strength and conditioning thing that's unique to martial arts, that's easy to plug into schools for people who want to be competitive and produce athletes and stuff. But right now we're not good at it. And you're right. Like it's people, we're trying to do too many things. We're trying to have all this formal stuff. We're trying to do kata and application of kata, and you're trying to do application of kata, which doesn't look exactly like kata, but you're also trying to perfect the aesthetic aspect of kata. Because you got to do that to pass your belt exam, and you got your 1 steps, and you got your self-defense sets, and you got your flow drills and all this stuff that's not, scientifically speaking, is actually not very closely related. And then you're trying to do sparring, which in my experience, most karate gyms neglects. I know you guys, I've seen your videos, you spar a lot, but most of the places I've been to, they don't spar that much. And if they do, it's a separate program. And you might or might not have to engage in it to rank up in your belt. And you just don't spar enough in the sparring program to get good at sparring. And if it's not in a sparring program, as part of regular class, you definitely don't spar enough to get good at sparring. So figure out what it is you want to do, and then allocate separate classes and separate resources to curriculum development to those things.
Yeah, we changed to, we got sparring now on every session, and that's kind of inspired the BJJ, right? You want the results in sparring, you need to spar. All the stuff is a kihon. You do do activity what you are training for, right? And I have to say that we've got visitors quite often from different dojos, and people changing, seeing how my white belts, not sounding being cocky, cope with other people from different dojos. it changes people's perception. If the white belts can spar
Yes.
like the brown belts,
Yeah.
then we're doing something different, right? So I'm
Hmm.
very happy about that.
Yeah. I'm really glad to hear that.
Josh, I've got a headache now on the informations. Where can I learn?
Yeah.
Where can I learn more about it? Where are the resources? I know your
Yeah.
website, the Combat Learning, is a great resource, and you've got the Substack or Patreon. Come on, share us where find you, where we can
Substack.
support you.
Yep. Yeah, so combatlearning.com is where you should start. Get on the free email list. I'll send you a bunch of free resources, but among them is a sort of a cheat sheet to help you understand the transfer of learning and how to design your games in a way that is more likely to transfer. So it's like a real succinct crash course in representative learning design. It's got a checklist you can look at. I also give you an introduction to motor learning, so you kind of understand some of the basic terms and why they're important, so you can start thinking more intelligently and in a more informed way about what you think about training and
Mhm.
training methodology. The podcast is it's always been Combat Learning Podcast, but the title now is Teaching Martial Arts by Combat Learning on all podcast platforms. I did that for keyword reasons, so it's more findable. But Teaching Martial Arts by Combat Learning should be available in anywhere anywhere podcasts are available. I would suggest looking at standard jujitsu on YouTube if you want an example of what it looks like for jujitsu in a very high fidelity application, very informed application of constraints-led approach to grappling. You can take the principles from that and start playing around with what you want to do in striking. Look at, I really like what Scott Seavright's done with the striking. I don't know if he has a ton of videos out on it, but you can reach out to Scott Seavright. Primal MMA coaching podcast is his old podcast. Those episodes are up. They're still good to listen to. I think his website's primalmke.com. And so you can probably reach out to him via email there or through Instagram. Definitely talk to him. He has more practical experience applying it to kickboxing and striking in general than I do. I applied it when I was at the end of my teaching journey. And so most of my application has been through other people since then. So he has more direct experience with that. Yeah, there's a lot of people out there, too many to name, but those are the top guys between striking and grappling to look at, and just let yourself go down the rabbit hole.
Josh, thank you very much for your time, and I'm hope to get you again on the podcast and share my experiences, because I'm going to try to apply some of the stuff we talk about and some stuff I'm reading about, and then maybe you can give me your opinion about if I'm doing it right way or I'm doing it wrong way.
Yeah, please. I love to hear this stuff. And anyone listening, I forgot to mention, don't hesitate to reach out to me either.
Mm.
I wish people would reach out to me with actual questions about how to do things instead of like try and get a pot shot on me about something, or get one over, like an argument or something. I love to explain this stuff. I love to be a guy that you bounce ideas off of, and I'm not going to charge you $1,000 a month to do that. Like, you just send me an Instagram message. So please keep in contact, keep me up to date. Do not hesitate to ask any questions.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well done for listening to all of it. You are a superhero. Thank you very much for your support. And if you could leave us that review on a podcast platform, that would be amazing. I appreciate your time, appreciate your support, and I wish you all the best until the next one.
This podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.
If you're a maintenance supervisor for a commercial property, you've had to deal with everything from leaky faucets to flickering light bulbs. But nothing's worse than that ancient boiler that's lived in the building since the day it was built, 50 years ago. It's enough to make anyone lose their cool. That's where Grainger comes in. With industrial-grade products and dependable fast delivery, Grainger can help with any challenge. From worn-out components to everyday necessities. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.